going to be very brief and giving a few remarks by saying I'm just thrilled that we were able to partner with Maynard and that we're able to partner with Korn Ferry to present this, and partner with Scripps, who's doing great stuff, to present this webinar. And before we get started, I'm even more thrilled that the chairman of the NAB board and the president and CEO of Hearst Television and EVP of Hearst, Jordan Wortley, could join us, and that he's going to give some remarks. And I just have to say that Jordan and I began talking about diversity in earnest. He's participated in our programs, and we've always had an ongoing dialogue, but really in earnest about 2 years ago when he was starting to do some new things at Hearst. And so he's leading the pack, and we're thrilled that he's our chair right now. And so I'm going to turn it over to Jordan to say a couple of remarks, and then we'll get started. Jordan?
Well, great. Can you hear me, Michelle?
I can hear you.
Well, terrific. Thank you. And first of all, I just wanted to welcome everyone today. I would be remiss if I didn't reference that obviously everyone is wishing well thoughts for Senator Smith. We keep getting positive health updates on his progress. So all the positive thoughts that are flowing through the broadcast industry are certainly having their effect today, as Senator Smith is on a quick road to recovery. Secondly, I wanted to congratulate and thank Michelle for her leadership, not only of the NAB Foundation, but as now the Chief Diversity and Inclusion Officer of the NAB. So a lot of great work being done by Michelle. As Michelle said, we've been talking about this for 2 years, but I think in earnest over the last year, we've started to implement programs that I think are making a difference. The NAB board went through diversity and inclusion training in January to try to heighten awareness of the issues at hand, and I think that has led to more progress among a lot of the member companies. Michelle references Scripps. I'm very proud of Brian Lawler and his team, and have actually worked closely with Brian on some of the programs that they've implemented as others have. I should mention that the NAB plans to host more webinars like this one to offer other initiatives and resources as you build out your diversity strategy. And one resource that will be coming soon is a Diversity, Equity, and Inclusion Resource Center. The tool will offer resources and listings that can assist you with identifying consultants and DE&I trainers. You'll also be able to find organizations that can be a resource for your diversity recruitment, retention, and training efforts. And then finally, be on the lookout for an industry assessment that'll be sent from Michelle Duke. Please participate in completing this survey. Your input will be helpful to the NAB as they develop and provide additional resources that can assist in your efforts. So I know at Hearst we're doing the same thing right now. We're in the midst of a survey that concludes today, seeking input from our employees. I think transparency and discussion are the key to this, and that's why I'm so excited about today's program. So with that, Michelle, thank you for the opportunity to address the group, and I'll hand it back to you.
Thanks so much, Jordan, and thanks for those great words about Gordon. For those of you who have heard, we're just thrilled to hear more positive information this morning. And so with that, I would like to introduce Evelyn Sue. Evelyn and I go way back, and she has been at this type of work for a long time, certainly a wonderful influence in the industry, well respected, and now she's with Maynard. And I've known her for many years since she's been with Maynard, and so I'm so thrilled to have her as our moderator today. And with that, Evelyn, who is the co-executive director of Maynard Institute, I'm turning it over to you.
Thank you so much, Michelle, and thank you, Jordan, for setting the stage for our conversation today. If you are just joining this call, we've asked everyone except the speakers to mute themselves and to turn off your video. Let me introduce our panel. Martin Reynolds, my colleague, is the co-executive director for external affairs and funding for the Maynard Institute for Journalism Education. Prior to that, he served as a senior fellow for for the Institute, guiding our strategic planning and helping to oversee the planning and implementation of the Maynard Reimagine project. Andres Tapia is a global diversity and inclusion strategist and thought leader for Korn Ferry. He has been one of the leading voices in shaping a contemporary, next generation approach to diversity and inclusion. Danyelle Wright is Vice President for Employment and Labor Law and Chief Diversity Officer for the EW Scripps company. She leads Scripps's enterprise-wide diversity and inclusion strategies and serves as the employment attorney for the company. So to start, in the wake of the murder of George Floyd, there have been calls for social and racial justice coming from every facet of American life, from individuals in small towns to the heads of every major corporation. Will it lead to lasting change? And how to change? So, Andres, you have done a great deal of research on bias, behavioral bias, structural bias. Please share some insights from your research, the implications for organizations and companies as they seek to change.
Yeah, the worry is legitimate, whether the change will be lasting and will it be different this time than other times when there was hopes raised. Our research, which is both based on volume as well as behind closed doors working with executives, is that there is something palpably different about this. And my colleagues on the panel will talk about things maybe happening in other parts, but within corporations, just by terms of numbers, we did a webinar series that a 4-part series had a cumulative number of over 100,000 participants. And many of them were at the most senior level of organizations. And these, the outreach on the part of these organizations asking for help on what we call behavioral exclusion and structural exclusion has been unprecedented. And these leaders are coming at this in ways that they haven't before. Before they, the first part was maybe skepticism, like several years ago about this. Then they would say, I get the business case. I don't know what to do. But now what they're saying is, I or we, the leadership, need to take responsibility because we have the power. We can't delegate this to the chief diversity officer. We can't delegate it to HR. We can't delegate it to the employee resource groups. They're all important parts of the process. But if we don't take charge, if we don't lead this transformation, the systemic nature of what we're finally understanding is there won't be addressed. So when we look at the data, plenty of people have gone through unconscious bias training, and we believe in that kind of work. We believe in also behavioral interventions that look at privilege, whether it be white privilege or class privilege or male privilege. But behavioral change is not enough. When we do the analysis of organizations under structural inclusion or exclusion, we see so much inequity. Inequity in pay, inequity in opportunity, access, visibility, advancement, development, and also even inequity in performance ratings. It's rampant. And so the data is incontrovertible that systemic racism and systemic exclusion is there. But what's different today, and this gives me some hope, is that for the first time we're hearing out of the lips of CEOs and executives and even the heads of HR that perhaps this complaint and really accusation legitimate that there is exclusion and not inequity, and that there's systemic racism, that there's something to it, and the data proves it.
Right. Thank you. Martin, media has faced its own internal reckoning. It's not just police departments that have had to examine how they do business. Could you talk about that?
Yeah, absolutely. Glad to be here today. Thank you so much. Yeah, the media is really, I think what is an exciting opportunity in this moment is that, the Maynard Institute, we focus primarily on training journalists and also those who work within the news side, but also the business side of news organizations. And what we're really beginning to find is, for the first time, there's a conversation that is happening inside these newsrooms that has really not happened before. There's a call for a movement in newsrooms that mirrors the movements that we're seeing in the streets. But what we find that is really important is that, and Andres touched on this, is that the business case for diversity has seemed to be out there for some time, but perhaps it hasn't trickled down in news organizations, particularly in the newsroom, in the place where the journalism gets produced. And for the first time, to a great extent, that conversation is beginning to change. But I think what's also really vital here is that we have to look beyond just DEI, because DEI, diversity, equity, inclusion, are really sort of interventions that don't actually get at the structural issues that Andres is talking about. And so as a training organization, we are really pushing folks to think about, well, where are you now as an organization, and where is it that you want to get to? And the question being, why does this matter? And you're thinking about news organizations and their relationship to community, the opportunities that the demographic shifts present in communities, the rampant lack of trust that exists on the part of so many news consumers in particular, that this goes beyond simply a business imperative. I would argue that this goes to the very foundation of our democracy, and the very foundation, to a great extent, as what I'm talking about to publishers of the organizations that we are working, is that the soul of American journalism is at stake in this moment. And we have to think of it in that context, or the measures that we are going to undertake are not going to get at the real issues that are facing our country and that manifest themselves in our news organizations. And the other part that I want to talk about just briefly, and then I'll close, is that, we're not social justice. We're not a social justice organization. We're journalists, and we train journalists and news executives and the like. But we do take other trainings, particularly those in the social justice space. And one thing that really stood out to me when I took a recent training, because I wanted to sort of get a sense of, what are the conversations that are happening in other spaces that are training other people who would themselves consume news and so on and so forth. And what we are finding is that news organizations are viewed as sustainers and facilitators of systemic racism. And so we have to ask ourselves, is that who we want to be? And obviously, we're not saying that people in these organizations themselves are necessarily racist, but there is an ambient racism that has permeated these institutions for decades. And we have to get real about that fact. And then, as a result, how do we then make structural change to move beyond that? And last thing I will say is that this isn't something that can simply be done, roll up with a bouquet of flowers after decades and decades of mischaracterizing communities, ignoring communities, not covering certain communities. This is going to take time. It's going to take a considerable amount of time in order to build relationships, rebuild relationships, or to build relationships with the consumers that perhaps have never trusted you.
Thank you, Martin. Danyelle, Scripps has done a lot of innovation, has been a leader in this space. What are the steps that every executive should be taking right now to meet this call for change?
Thanks, Evelyn. And I wanted to just sort of begin where Martin ended, which is to know that this is not a flash in the pan and a one and done. If you're going to make real change, it is going to be an ongoing, multi-year, and perhaps a never-ending objective. And so if folks think you can dedicate resources or allocate human capital for a finite period of time, you would be ill-served to sort of lead that way. But I'll back up and say, let's talk about the folks that don't necessarily have embedded CDOs in their organization or a dedicated department that's talking about this, which is ultimately your question. I think there are 6 things that any leader, CEO, head of an agency can do. One, you have to communicate. which means I think you have to send a very clear message that you're committed to this to all your employees. You don't need a CDO for that. And that relates to the second point, which is commitment, which is you need to reiterate, perhaps with the assistance of your corporate communications team, that you're doing all that you can and will continue to do more to make the internal experience one of equity, fairness, and inclusion. 3, any CEO or head needs to understand your organization. Understand data from perhaps a different perspective than they ordinarily do, which means you need to know your demographics, what you're doing with your vendors, how that spend is diversified or not, what it looks like from a promotion standpoint in terms of upward mobility broken down by strata within your organization, hiring, and then even training. The fourth thing, which is the most, it seems like it could be the easiest, is that you have to have what I call authentic, tenacious, and courageous leadership. If you don't have experience managing across difference, now is not the time to fake it. If you need to learn more in this space, this is the time to raise your hand. If I had 2 sort of subsets of that, 2 words of advice, I would say, don't be afraid to be vulnerable, and I need you to get comfortable being uncomfortable really quickly. Which is harder for those who have escalated to a certain echelon to say, I don't know, but this might be a space where you have to do so. Next, just 2 more is that, it's sort of that whole concept of if you see something, say something. The sort of ostrich head in the sand approach is not going to work. What you've seen over the past couple of months is employees are calling employers out. If you go silent, if you try to ignore what is happening, they will not let you do so. So you have to come up with a message that you're comfortable with. And finally, just an overall understanding that it's about change management, which requires commitment and buy-in at the highest levels, which means you may need to create a sense of urgency that didn't otherwise exist within your team. If you don't have an EDI team department, you're going to enlist a volunteer army initially, but it can't be their space forever. And certainly it has to be an alignment to the business. So that's really bird's eye view things that you can do now in the absence of having someone who bears that responsibility.
Great, thank you. And picking up on what you said about some organizations that have seen employees calling them out, I want to call on Martin because you've worked with a number of organizations that have seen a lot of turmoil from within. And what guidance can you offer our audience on how you start addressing that?
Well, I think to Danielle's point, it's time to get real, folks. I mean, this is, none of us created this system that we are in, but the reality is this is an opportunity to really make some change around the systemic racism that has existed in our society and the inequities that exist. And so the big thing that we are really encouraging the news organizations that we've been working with, and I just want to say contextually, I have never seen this kind of insurrections, if you will, in news organizations. For the most part, in previous generations, there had been folks calling folks out in some years ago, but it's considerably different now. So often, if you were a person of color in an organization, you were seeking to really make change within the system to a great extent, and sort of protect the brand to a degree by not sort of going public. But now what we are seeing in organization after organization are groups within these organizations, and there are even some generational differences between these groups. Some of the younger folks are really just ready to burn things down, and it's interesting because they are often at odds with folks of color who have been in the organization and have really walked through fire to get where they are, and are sort of trying to navigate the dynamics of the need to potentially really make huge change, but to not necessarily destroy the institution and its brand in doing so. And so what we're seeing is that there are actually conflicts between these 2 generations. So I think the generational fault line piece is going to be really critical. The training that we focus on is the framework through which we see this work is through the fault lines, which is where are the places where the social tensions have met. And so those social tensions have really revolved around race, class, gender, generation, geography, sexual orientation, and obviously the social fissures of politics, religion, and ability. And our framework talks about how you align across these social fault lines impacts how you see the world. It's why two people can look at the same thing and come away with very different perceptions about what they just saw. And I think to a great extent, it's why CEOs who have tended to be a very homogenous group have not necessarily seen, or GMs and others in leadership, have not necessarily seen the importance of this. It's not because folks are bad, it's because they align across the fault line. So as a certain generation or certain race, then perhaps you are not seeing the world in the same way that others are. And therefore you cannot necessarily have sort of that lived experience and understand the need or how this actually affects others who are not particularly of your group. And so we talk about that. And the other part that I think is really vital in this is, and to also to Danyelle's point, is that this really has to matter to you. We're seeing positions being created, managing editor of diversity, this and that of diversity, and I'm not one and vice president of diversity, and I don't want to in any way say that those positions aren't vital and the people that in them aren't skilled. They're incredibly skilled and should be commended because they are going to do some of the most challenging work within your organization. But the reality is what it ends up often being is women of color, people of color, women of color in particular, who are tied to having to fix the most challenging systemic problem in our society. They are tethered to the success and they can be tethered to the failure. And so the bottom line is that it actually has to come from the people who has CEO and GM in their title and not those below. Because, and the other part that I want to point out too is that so often people of color are brought into this process. People, you want to extend, well, hey, be part of the solution. That's great. But the reality is the emotional labor that it takes to do this work in our institutions is significant. And so often folks are not compensated for that work and it's not tied to their performance. So if you want people to get involved in the organization and to own the solutions, then they need to be rewarded for that work, that emotional labor. Because the reality is this is difficult stuff. It's difficult stuff to navigate. It's difficult, but imagine how difficult it is to actually live it, to breathe it, to be a victim of it, to have to navigate this as a human being throughout your entire life, and then be asked to help fix a problem that really is not of your making. So I will just leave it there.
Thank you, Martin. I want to pick up on your mention of generational fault lines, and we have certainly seen that. And I wanted to ask Andres and Danyelle for advice. How do you address this generational chasm, as it were? Andres, do you want to start?
Yes, and no matter where you look, whether it's in news media or any other industry, the generational fault lines are evident. And before this current racial reckoning, we were seeing it in a variety of things, where you do work from, the use of technology, the expectations about how much work you do, and even expectations about time off and being free to do other things in your life other than work. So these tensions have been rising quite a bit. And now you have the racial reckoning, which is not only among people of color who are younger, but it's a whole diverse generation that they today already reflect the fact that by 2040, half of this country will be people of color. Well, between Gen Z and Gen Y, they already reflect that reality. So their view of race and equality and the injustices behind it, and the fact that things have not changed. They are at a point now where they're not tolerant of any elder, of any other generation telling them, well, be patient, we're working it out, you don't understand. And they go, no, we understand very well. We understand that racism has been here for 400 years and that the inequities and injustices that have kept people of color down are still there and you haven't done anything about it. So that is very clear to us. And now we have the voice, we have the outrage, we have the numbers, and we have the means, meaning, with social media, communication, as we well know, has gone horizontal. And so that amplifies voices that often did not have access to those channels of communication. So and on the parental side, because this is very important, a lot of these leaders, a lot of CEOs that I'm working with intimately behind closed doors, many of them are not only being affected by the younger employees, they're being affected by the children because their children are on the street, right? And they're having dinner table conversations about how to protect themselves against tear gas and being beat up by the police, regardless of their color, as they stand in solidarity with Black Lives Matter and the cause behind that. So and demographically, and I'll wrap up with this point here, is the numbers are now overwhelming. In about 5-6 years, the last of the baby boomers will have hit retirement age. Some will still hang on, right? And that's fine and that's good. But in terms of sheer numbers, the illusion of holding on to the levers of power are just going to be gone with each year that ticks by and each calendar page that flies by. So more and more, this younger generation is going to be in positions of power. So they're not just asking for attention. They're not only going to speak truth to power, they're going to be the power. And they're already exerting that muscle today.
Thank you. Danyelle, what do you advise managers who are facing these challenges from the younger generation?
I think, there's always been a sense of young whippersnappers. They should be looking and listening and listen to their elders. But I think to Andres's point, those times are sort of come and gone, and we're needing, one of the things I recommend for whether it's CDOs or managers is that you need to listen to all employees, but really coalesce around millennials, the younger employees. Each generation has had their cross to bear, if you will, in terms of what people think about that generation. But in response to your ultimate question, which is, I think, this generational divide and how you see this sort of divergence of opinion between younger and more seasoned folks. No, this is a time when personal and sort of professional lives are colliding in ways that we had not really imagined. And the racial unrest that was brought about as a result of the brutal killings of Floyd and Arbery and Breonna Taylor have really required people to look internally and decide how they want to participate and engage. And what we've found, and I'm sure media companies across this country have found, is that reiterating, sort of the fact that we want to maintain our professional objectivity and sending out written missives about that, which we have also done, probably is not enough for them. I mean, what they're saying is, maybe we need to upset the apple cart. If these are to be living, breathing documents, these principles of journalism, objectivity, maybe now's the time to revisit that. And I think slowly but surely, companies, organizations are starting to say, okay, we're going to take a look at things like social media policies, and we will at least entertain the conversation. And I can tell you, I don't necessarily think before this moment, there would have been that openness to do so. So this does create an opportunity to be progressive, open-minded, to at least hear different perspectives. I know there are other panels where folks are talking about this, moderated by Dorothy Tucker. NABJ is doing a panel on this yet this week to talk about that collision between the personal and the professional. So, I think ultimately, actively listening, not just sort of placating folks, is really an initial step for managers.
Evelyn, could I build on something Danyelle just said?
Please.
Yeah, I really appreciate what you said, Danyelle. And I think it's also really vital to just call this out, that objectivity never existed. And for us to think that it actually did is really quite ludicrous, because human beings aren't objective. How we align across these social fault lines completely impacts how we see the world. And so so objectivity, what has really been, I think, a tremendous issue here, and there's an opportunity to rethink, is what is the gaze through which we see the work that we do? And for journalists of all stripes, but particularly journalists of color, there has been an expectation to come in and to conform into these institutions, right? And what really, I think the opportunity before us is to transform these we don't want to just talk about what we don't want to be. We should certainly be institutions that are anti-racist, but what do we then want to become? And I think what's exciting is the opportunity to become institutions not just of inclusion, because you can be included easily, right? If somebody doesn't really want you there, well, we'll just include them, it's fine. But what we really should be aspiring to achieve are institutions of belonging. Because when you belong someplace, then you can bring your whole self to someplace. And the reality is that diversity equates to trust. And there's the Trust Project, which was founded by Sally Lehrman, that looked at the 8 core indicators of what is trustworthy content. And they created transparency standards, particularly in the digital space. And of the 8 core indicators, 2 of them talk specifically about trust. About diversity and diverse voices equating to trust. So people seeing themselves, hearing themselves, whether it's the music, whether it's the journalism that we're doing, having more diverse voices and a gaze that isn't just a white male gaze is actually good for business. It's good for society. It's good for the world. It's good for the human beings that are comprised in your institutions. So, and I just would close with this notion that objectivity was ever a thing. It's sort of what by that logic, that would mean, so some journalists of color were pulled off of stories you may have seen at the Pittsburgh Post-Gazette because there was a concern that these black journalists would be perceived as biased for covering these protests. But by that logic, that means that white journalists can't cover anything because for most of our existence, the gaze of the journalism that has been produced has been through that gaze. And so that makes no sense. So I just want to absolve us all of this notion of objectivity. It hasn't existed. It doesn't exist. What we should aspire to is balance and fairness.
Yeah, and Martin, it's very entrenched, right? Part of my background is I went to medical school of journalism, and I remember, I grew up in Lima, Peru, and because I was interested in journalism, I was, as a 4th grader, reading the international edition of Time magazine, which was in English. My mom American, my dad Peruvian. And, I would read these stories and they were beautifully written. They were nicely laid out, nice graphics, and often inaccurate in my point of view, because it was seen through the eyes of journalists that did not understand our culture, our economy, our values. So when I came to Northwestern, I debated my, Chicago Tribune professors, about objectivity. And, at that point, it was like, you never question that mantra, right? That you can be objective and a teacher be objective. And I really believe that we can learn how to manage our subjectivity, which is important. Yeah. But we always would see that through the gaze, to use your term. And I remember having this argument with one of my professors. And for those of you who are older school, like you'll recognize this typesetting symbol. At one point he just turned his back on me and he wrote 30 on the blackboard, right? So end of piece, right? End of article, we're done here. And that's how closed-minded it was with a person of color from outside the US in trying to engage in conversation about who defines what news is and who defines what is seen through our eyes and our minds. And that speaks to the power in the business case, in the mission case of diversity, because we need each other's gazes, right? To interpret the complexity of the world around us.
Right. Thank you all for that very robust discussion. I want to remind our participants that you can put questions into the chat, or if you prefer, you can virtually raise your hands. And we have set aside some time to address your questions. Danyelle, you gave some tremendous advice at the beginning.
Evelyn, you've cut out briefly.
Advice about avoiding missteps, please.
Yes, I think I heard your question. I also experienced the cutout, but I think we're good now. So your focus was just on the mistakes. And so what I would say is I culled it down to a list of 10. Sort of things to avoid when building out a strategy. I'm sure there are more, but I'll just give my sort of top 10. One is, I think, for organizations to fail to define what diversity means within their organization, especially when their footprint is both national and international. It can mean very different things outside of the mainland United States. So it's important that you define what diversity means. The second is, A failure to tie diversity to business objectives. So if it doesn't sit in alignment adjacent to business goals and objectives, it's hard to get folks' attention as it relates to EDI strategies. Another failure, a third one, is to make it just about race. Oftentimes, that is sort of what comes top of mind. But as you know, diversity is so much more broadly defined than that. We certainly have embraced 4 pillars at Scripps, but companies all across the country decide whether they want to focus on differently abled or single parents or race and ethnicity or gender or GLBTQIA or veterans. There's so much more than just race. Fourth mistake is to under-resource your efforts. So to embed someone, what you're seeing now are folks that are carving out space and budgets for CDOs. They don't have a budget, they don't have a team, no human capital, no resources, influence without authority. So you really have to think critically about the placement, more than just the title, and making sure that they're connected within the business. Fifth thing would be, and I think I talked about it already, really installing a CDO and delegating all responsibility to that person, so that one person is what diversity means at X company. So that if that person, God forbid, is run over by a bus or leaves to go somewhere else, then nobody else knows how to pick up the pieces. So it's got to be embraced by all. Otherwise, it doesn't ever move forward. Next up would be giving sort of credit or points flash for activity, but not measuring progress. So you have to have a data-centric approach to determine whether you're actually moving the needle in an appreciable manner. Or sort of kicking off with a big splash. Lots of companies have, made multi-million-dollar pledges to social justice or amplifying Black and brown voices in their content. But what will the follow-up be? How will they cascade this message down within their organization? Will it just be that one thing that people remember and then they're done? Another sort of small one, but it happens over and over, is when companies do surveys, like engagement surveys, but they never report out on the findings or the results. There's no transparency, which I know Andres discussed at the outset, which is you got to talk about it and you have to act on it. It doesn't help when you ask people their opinion and then you blatantly ignore it. It's almost like it's a useless and futile exercise. 2 more. One is only focusing on the diversity piece, which is we got folks in the door, look at our numbers, and they just think organically people are going to be groomed, sponsored, developed, promoted, and go up the ranks within the organization, when really you have to have intentional efforts throughout the employee life cycle. And then finally, in the absence of perhaps a department or CDO sort of piling on, meaning giving people extra responsibilities and they still have a full-time job. So you're expecting them to partner internally within an organization and do something else, which can sometimes be problematic. I'm certain my cohorts have other things to add, but those are sort of the things that sort of top of mind is don't do this. And then I think later on, we're going to talk about what you should do. And perhaps you addressed that, but I didn't hear it.
Yeah, that was a great list. I loved it. And just one point on the engagement. The other mistake I see on engagement is reporting out by this category called people of color. And that is such a misleading number. It's good for about 7 seconds. And after that, you have to say, what's the Black experience? What's the Latinx experience? What's the Asian experience? What's the mixed race experience? And then even further, what's the intersectional experience, right? So what's the Black female or the Latino male experience, et cetera, et cetera. Only then can we really get into the nuances of the reality of an organization. So I just wanted to add that to your list.
Great. Thank you. And we do have a question. Michelle, can you, I believe it was emailed. Can you read the question?
Yes. First question. From a baby boomer and a white male who says that he feels his voice is not really wanted and appreciated all the time in diversity conversations, and that he feels he has a lot to learn in creating and building a more diverse newsroom, but lives in fear of saying the wrong thing and or being fired. And then ask Sorry, just something popped on my screen there. There seems to be an effort to not to hear all voices, but to hear progressive voices. How do we cover rural Americans and the working class and seniors?
Who wants to start?
Well, I could jump in on that. Well, I appreciate the question, and it's interesting because I was doing a training for a particular organization, and the executive editor talked about, and he was a middle-aged white male, and talked about how he actually felt attacked, right? He actually felt that, and this was more than a year ago before all of this occurred. It sort of speaks to the generational push that had already been occurring, and I guess some of this was already bubbling up. And he was really upset, talking about how he felt his voice was not heard, and that he, as a white male, felt that he was actually under attack, which I felt to be really interesting. And my advice to him was that I first and foremost, I sympathized with him. But the other part was, I said, but you also are in a position of power. You are in a position of authority. And so imagine how it feels to be under attack and to actually be at a power deficit. So just to sort of wanted to raise that up for him so that he sort of could sort of reposition his thinking a bit. But the other is to the point of, to the questioner, I think you have to educate yourself. I think you have to take it upon yourself, and I'm happy to drop into the chat a listing of some resources that folks can read, is to really sort of elevate your own thinking around this sort of racial reckoning in this social moment, and to increase your level of cultural competency, so that when you come to these, and that you don't ask someone else to inform you, because when you have the opportunity to sort of raise your own consciousness, there's a lot of tremendous books out there right now and readings that folks can tap into, so that you increase your level of cultural competency and awareness of these issues, so that when you begin to have those conversations, as soon as you open your mouth, people are like, oh, okay, well, this person has really thought to educate themselves about systemic racism and white supremacy and so on and so forth, and how and what they can bring to the conversation is clearly is informed and nuanced. And I think to the last part about sort of how do we cover these other communities, I mean, I think the geography fault line is also one that is incredibly important right now in our society, as we're seeing in terms of how different states view the severity of the COVID-19 pandemic, right? Who's wearing masks, who isn't? I mean, geography has become a huge fault line in our society. And so I think recognizing that reality and then bringing that information, understanding that how the geographic fault line comes into play, and then embracing it, and having people thinking, particularly from a hiring and retention perspective, that yes, we need different constituencies. This speaks to Danyelle's point about diversity being many different things. I think it's a vital component to any conversation, geography.
Yeah, and also if I could go through a different door to address the white male that Martin just did, you know, a lot of my work is actually working with white males, because I work quite a bit with executives in the C-suite. And part of the work that we do together is for them to really, I see themselves as part of the diversity story. Because in the end, who is diverse? We all are diverse. We all are unique, have an irreproducible story that nobody else has. Now, inclusion and equity is exploring how our diversity confers on us unearned advantages or disadvantages on the basis of who we are. So we got to do that work. And so getting leaders personalizing the diverse story and that they are part of the narrative is a big part. And in that, being able to share it, to be storytellers of their own story in the context of the human societal story that we're all in. Because these CEOs, many of them say, I want my employees to bring their whole selves to work. And then I ask them their personal story, and there's all kinds of stories. Some, yes, grew up privileged, but a lot of them did not. Many of them are first generation going to college. Some were on food stamps. Some were affirmative action recipients from Appalachia because of programs for people from Appalachia. So my question to them is, well, do your people that you lead know that about you? They go, no, I keep those two separate. I'm like, well, how do you expect your people to bring their whole selves to work if you are not? Right? So whatever your story is, whether it's privilege or not, acknowledging it, sharing it, does several things. You show up authentically. You recognize whether you have or you don't have privilege. And in that, you engage people on their story and what their narrative is. And then the final thing that we engage is, you know, you don't have to be apologetic about your privilege. You don't have to be ashamed of it. You don't have to feel guilty about it. But you have it. And let's talk about it. And then let's talk about how you're going to use that privilege and that power on behalf of the very diversity, inclusion, and equity that you have already proclaimed that you're committed to. And that shifts the conversation and engages them, and they see I can be an active participant in that. And that sort of starts lowering sort of this fear of stepping into pitfalls, or, you know, this fear of saying the wrong thing. Wow, you know, it's like you're a lot more powerful than that. You should be able to manage your words. And even if you misstep, if you show up authentically, people will give you a lot of latitude. And that's the basis in which we need to engage in this racial reckoning moment.
Danyelle, did you want to add?
No, I think my brethren have it covered.
Okay. Michelle, we have another question, right?
Yes. The question is, as a young chief diversity officer within an organization, how should I deal with the ageism that I'm afraid I'm going to face?
Panel.
Maybe we defer to
I think
Danyelle.
Yeah, I can give it a stab. I probably don't meet the criterion that you've outlined. That's okay. I'm, you know, just a little shy over 40, so now protected by the ADEA. But what I will say is, I think one of the things that either Martin or Andres talked about at the top, which is the mantra that how I carry myself as a chief diversity officer, which is I have to assume positive intent. And there are many times I have it written across my board when I was actually in my office 21 weeks ago, but I have it sort of seared in my memory bank as well, is that there are a lot of things that people will likely assume as a result of how I show up. Immutable characteristics, you know, the fact that I am a person of color, African-American, that I am a woman and I'm over 40, much like yourself, that perhaps, you know, physically you present as younger. That does not discount the influence and power that you will have within an organization. So I think, you know, even if you have it in the recesses of your mind that this might be an impediment for you, I would also figure out ways to use it to your advantage, and to assume, not, you know, negatively, but to assume that people want to travel on the journey that perhaps you're responsible for discharging.
Thank you. Our other panelists, any thoughts?
I think she covered it really well.
Yes, thank you.
The next, you ready?
We did get a request for the contact information from all of our panelists. So if they could each put that into the chat. And I know we're coming up on time, so I wondered if we could call on each of our panelists to give some parting thoughts, parting advice. And I leave it to you to figure out who wants to start.
I'll begin with, you know, some of the tips that I would have for companies that are contemplating a diversity strategy. I know I've already started with 10, and then before that 6, that's okay. It's only 5 this time, so no worries. And I call it my sort of A to the 5th power, which is 1, aspire, have a roadmap, figure out where you want to go, create the value proposition for your company, and set some minimal additional or initial clear targets. 2, for companies, assess your readiness. Is your company ready to go there? Do you have a complete understanding of the current dynamics or situation in terms of stats as well as mindsets? Are there some sort of culture overhauls that will be necessary for you to embark on this journey? 3, architect, which do you have the tools and buy-in from senior leadership, which is absolutely vital. In other words, do you have what you need to get to, you know, whether it's from its infancy, a foundational D&I strategy or a world-class D&I strategy. 4th, you've got to be able to act. which is you have to create programming, initiatives, tactics, execute, and monitor. I cannot underscore the importance of having metrics associated with your tactics, and make sure that you're being transparent internally with your workforce, your board of directors, if you have one, etc. And then finally, make sure that you advance, that you have forward moving momentum. You're always thinking about, how do we keep the ball moving forward? How do we address potential mindset barriers, whether that's the training from an unconscious bias standpoint, bias mitigation, whatever you can do to get folks ready to continue moving the ball. And that's sort of my tips for moving towards or moving your journey forward from an equity, diversity, inclusion standpoint.
Thank you, Danyelle.
I'll go next. You know, that 4-part webinar series that I referred to at the top of the hour, one of them was a panel of CHROs, the other one was a panel of CEOs and board directors. And one of the questions that I posed to them was, you know, the Minneapolis City Council voted to dismantle the Minneapolis Police Department because they felt that they were beyond reform. They had to basically start over. So the question to them, the CHROs and then the board directors, CEOs, was if they were willing to do that, and you can debate, you know, right or wrong, better or worse or whatever, but they went there. What is it within corporate America, and in this case here within broadcasting, that is beyond reform, that it has to be dismantled, that we just can't patch it because, you know, it's going to systemically, it's just going to keep generating, you know, the same results. And one example of that, when we do deep D&I diagnostics and talent flow analysis, and we do things like an advancement velocity index, comparing the advancement velocity of different demographic groups within organizations, when all things are being equal, but then you see some groups advance to a different rate than others, then you start getting at the root causes of what is going on. And in one organization, the root cause, yeah, they lack of equity and representation, lack of equity and promotion, but the root cause was lack of equity and lateral movement, because we saw in the data that lateral movements were predictive of promotion. So then we looked at an equity analysis on lateral movements, which is just no promotion, no salary increase, but just new assignments, new opportunities, new visibility. And this is the results. Women were 2 times less likely compared to white males to have a lateral movement. Latinos are 6 to 7 times less likely, and African Americans and Blacks were 12 to 14 times less likely to have lateral movement. So the root cause was not the lack of promotions, because by then what you needed was the visibility of these lateral movements to then make you promotion eligible. The inequity was there. So when we talk about dismantling, right, we just can't have employee resource groups as a corrective action or mentoring program and sponsorship, which I'm a big believer in all of those. But we have to go deep into the very systems of how people advance and get promoted and get visibility. And when it comes to broadcasting, right, and journalism, you know, there's the plum assignments and there's the high visibility opportunities to report from certain situations, certain kinds of stories. And then the backwater stories, right, the relegated, marginal, back of the hour stories. So let's make sure that we're really giving equal opportunity so everybody can rise to fullest potential and we can hear the diversity of voices, front of camera, back of the camera, and every aspect of the journalistic process.
Oh, that's so well said, both of you. I guess that maybe I'll say 3 things and then maybe leave with more of an aspirational tone, since my colleagues really dropped it like it's hot on the specificity. So one of the things that we talk about, particularly as it relates to journalism organizations, is thinking about your vision. So vision for the publication, who are you for? Who have you served? And who should you be serving? Where are the opportunities for you to serve, right? As these efforts to move away from ad-based models to subscriber models, the amount of information that people have on their existing audience and not on the audience of the future is striking. So who are you for? Who have you been for? Who have you ignored? And what needs to change? The other is your coverage. What has your coverage, what harm has been done? Since journalism institutions have been sustainers and facilitators of systemic racism for decades, particularly mainstream news organizations, it's not arguable. So then what is the harm that has been done? what needs to change? How does your coverage need to change to mitigate that harm? The other and I would say to that, that news organizations should really think about the creation of an organizing editor position, an editing position that is actually focused on engaging and utilizing community organizing techniques to build relationships over time. It would be, because we talk about community engagement, but community engagement tends to be with your existing community, whereas organizing is about going out and connecting and galvanizing people around what we activate around, which is news and information. Third is the culture. What is the culture of your organization? Many news organizations continue to be toxic, particularly newsrooms. So what is the culture shift that has to change in those organizations to make them places that are hospitable, that they are places that people want to belong? And a lot of that has to do with, I mean, there's been so much tumult that has happened for every journalist or most journalists. But that is even more the case for journalists of color. And then particularly Black journalists and Latinx journalists. And so the last thing that I would say is more speaking to the opportunity that this moment, that we must meet the moment. There is an opportunity here. There is a reckoning here where change can be made. This country, it's the promise that has never been fully achieved for so many is manifesting itself every day. Then we see it on the streets, and the pain and the struggle that folks have been trying to navigate for so long. There is a movement on the streets. There needs to be a movement in our institutions to meet this moment so that we can then better serve this incredible country that we all live in, so that we can meet the opportunity to evolve as an organization, as organizations, as institutions, because the reality is it's not just about money. I mean, it is about money, but journalism is not a Tide Pod. And I'm coming up this from a journalistic perspective. Journalism is not a Tide Pod. It's not like any other product. It is the only profession that is mentioned in the Constitution, and it is about our people within our democracy having the information necessary to make the decisions that affect their lives. It is something wholly unique. And so us not meeting this challenge puts our nation in peril. And so I think rather than looking at it from that perspective of fear, let's look at it from the perspective of opportunity. That you all, the folks particularly on this call, are more positioned than anyone to make that kind of transformation. So do it. That would be, and we stand here and ready to help in any way we can at the Maynard Institute. So thank you.
Thank you. Thank you, all of you, for your, not just the insights, but the inspiration. Thank you to Michelle and to Jordan and the NAB for organizing this. And thank you all for participating in this conversation. Michelle, let me turn it back to you.
I would just like to echo your thanks, Evelyn, and to Martin and Andreas and Danyelle for your fantastic insight and your expertise in such a really good conversation. Thank you so much for taking the time to do this today, and thanks to everyone who attended. More to come.
Thank you.
Okay.
It was a pleasure, a privilege. Thank you.
Thank you. It was a privilege. Yeah.
Thank you, Evelyn, for hosting us.
Pleasure.
Thank you, Evelyn. Great work.
Yeah, and Danyelle, good.
It was fun. Thank you.
Danyelle, good job.
Danielle.
Yeah.
Bye,
Andres.
guys.
Bye, Michelle.
All right, thank y'all. Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.